Behold, my glorious supporter EyePatchNotes has requested some discussion on riding effects. We start off with a nice definition. I love it. EyePatchNotes says one of the entry-level Buildcraft questions that comes up is, why would I use this mechanic? In personal parlance, why would I take this bus? EyePatchNotes says that the EyePatch answer points toward riding effects. Here's our definition. A riding effect is the extra line or lines of text in game piece B, which game piece A doesn't have. Game piece A has fewer lines of text. So basically there might be a simple version of the thing, and then another version that does that thing, but also does something else. So heavy caliber in Warframe. It's serration. It gives you base damage. It's literally serration, but it also reduces your accuracy. It's a rider effect. Cool. Warframe, indeed, EyePatchNotes goes on, has a number of interesting examples of the highest levels of play. Primed and galvanized mods, corrupted, amalgam mods, and beyond. You can look at sources of base damage. There are just a lot of mods in Warframe that give you base damage. And it's funny because in Warframe, they're all like kind of weirdly balanced. Like the more narrow ones are less damage or the same amount, rather than being a trade-off. They're just worse unless you want more usually. But interestingly, that doesn't really matter for this topic. Sometimes there might just, if there's a unique thing the thing does, so that's a good enough reason to use it. This is a place where, if I'll digress for a moment, EyePatchNotes and I are really on the same page. For me, I'm talking about builds not just for my own entertainment. I'm talking about them for a broad audience. And I can't know what you might find fun, but I can guess what you might find fun. And the way you can do that reliably is by looking at what things do something unique. If something does something pretty much the same as everything else, players will care less. That will correlate with players caring less. Some people will like it for whatever reason, but people will care less. People will care more if it's something relatively unique. And so it's predictable then that unique things do, provide build decisions that players are reliably, vaguely interested in, mostly for the most part. So generally, when I evaluate something as a build option, unless it's atrociously terrible in some obvious way, if it does something unique, that's kind of already enough reason for it to be worthwhile, in that there will be a place where a player that wants to use it will benefit from it, simply because it has a unique effect. And a lot of this parlay is going to go on to talk about why or how that happens, which I think is really interesting, but I just wanted to ground that part slightly. Here's an example. A few subsets of mods take a little off the top. I love that wording, EyePatchNotes, in exchange for offering a little extra. So Killing Blow in Warframe gives you base damage, but only for heavy attacks, and less than Prime Pressure Point, which gives you base damage for everything and you get more of it. But Killing Blow also gives you wind-up speed, basically heavy attack speed, which is an additional thing. So if you want wind-up speed, you can sacrifice some base damage to get it. A lot of people would look at, and have looked at, Killing Blow and said this is useless because it's less base damage all the time. It's always less base damage, but it's more damage per second almost all the time for heavy attack weapons, because the wind-up speed increases how fast you do the thing. The question is really, do you want wind-up speed? Because if you do, it's mathematically going to be more damage on a heavy attack weapon. If you don't, it probably won't be. And so there's a clear decision point, provided that the player wants anything that could be good. That's kind of the key assumption here. For some people, they just don't want that. That's fine. But that is irrelevant to whether it's good in theory or interesting in theory. It may just be in practice that players don't desire that thing. Heavy Caliber and Magnum Force, EyePatchNotes goes on, butt up against the recent availability of base damage. There's a lot of different ways to get base damage in Warframe now. And Heavy Caliber and Magnum Force are weird because they give you the same or less base damage than the normal base damage mod for their categories, but they also reduce your accuracy. Now that can sometimes be good. EyePatchNotes mentions the rider effect of negative accuracy is rare. That's pretty much the only place you can get that. So if you want to reduce the weapon's accuracy, that's a go-to. Again, there's theoretically a use. They're unique, and so they kind of automatically are worthwhile as a Buildcraft consideration, but you, the player, may simply not like them, you know? And obviously, as a variant of a way to get base damage, they're not particularly unique because we have so many ways to do that. But that wasn't always true. The quirk of increasing a weapon's area of effect without by reducing the accuracy can be considered the main effect, and base damage the riding effect. Similarly, negative fire rate can be good in some contexts, right? Oftentimes it is easiest to think about these from a theoretical perspective by looking at the thing that makes them unique as the primary effect, not because it's necessarily the best effect or the most important effect, but because that's the only thing that really matters when you read the mod in Warframe or whatever, is that if the game is balanced around those, then you wouldn't consider this unless the rider effects apply. So do they? No, then it doesn't even matter what the primary effect is. I mean, it might, but that can often be a surprisingly effective way to look at effects like this. EyePatchNotes goes on to talk about set mods. Set mods like Gladiator Vice and Vigilante Pursuit in Warframe are close to direct upgrades of existing mods, Fury and Enemy Sense, by offering the same stats with an extra hook for the set bonus. And of course, when this is done, it's generally either because there is a better version of the mod that the mod is an upgrade of. There's Primed Fury. Gladiator Vice is better than Fury in every way, but not Prime Fury. Or in Vigilante Pursuit and Enemy Sense's case, people might want to use both, and people often use neither. It's enemy radar radius increase, which I guess makes it sort of okay. Again, I think Warframe is an interesting example here because there's so many examples in Warframe of like really messy or just kind of bad game design philosophy where like, why is Vigilante Pursuit literally just better than Enemy Sense? Why are those different mods? Why a million times why? But it's actually useful to consider for this discussion because Warframe is a perfect example in that way, because it gives us lots of space to think about. Well, but so they do both exist, though. The game designers insisted on making both of those exist. So what does that do? You know, the player considers using both, which is weird. Or, you know, Fury and Gladiator Vice. It's harder to get Gladiator Vice. It's rarer, you know. Again, I think that's a not compelling game design, but it is really interesting for this discussion topic. Going further along with EyePatchNotes' text post. These are often longer, and I like to talk about them as we go. EyePatchNotes says, as an aside, writing effects were alluded to in a previous parlay. We had talked about stat and slot efficiency, and I wanted to revisit that. The idea here is that when a mod does two things, or when a build piece does two things, there's inherent value there. Something I find really interesting in game design that various games do in various ways is how the game evaluates multitasking. You mentioned a riding effect could be called a multitasking effect, or a hybrid effect, or a dual effect. Multitasking is a good one here. This idea that if something gives you crit chance and crit damage, it's kind of inherently better than something that gives like an equivalent amount, we'll get back to that, of just crit chance, because crit chance and crit damage make each other good. So having them together is inherently valuable in some way. Now, you might be playing a game where it's trivially easy to get a lot of both, or, you know, it's not hard to check both boxes. But in a lot of games, that's not true. Warframe and actually Genshin Impact is a really good example of a game where having both crit chance and crit damage, meaningful amounts of each together, is disproportionately more valuable because you have very limited space in which to get both. So if the player was given the option to have 150% crit chance or 75% crit chance and 75% crit damage in Warframe, that multitasking hybrid mod with the crit chance and the crit damage would be very, very good in Warframe, simply because it's good by itself. It kind of saves a mod slot while giving you meaningful damage. Now, on a lot of weapons in Warframe, in practice, I think you would probably equip a crit chance or crit damage mod and this hybrid mod, or you just go ahead and equip one crit chance and one crit damage mod. But there would be a lot of situations where you just want one more mod for some kind of an additional multiplier, maybe an augment for some utility on the weapon, and having a mod that gives you both at once that work together would be really good. That would be uniquely powerful. Now, of course, you could just have crit chance and then you get crits. You know, it's really only crit damage that works without a partner. But it's a simple example of how just providing an equivalent amount of a thing, but split between two things that are valuable together, is inherently valuable. And so when you look at various games, they'll treat that as a kind of different in terms of its power budget, if you will. This idea of a power budget being that the amount of something you're putting on a game piece is like worth that amount. In Genshin Impact, the famous example is that crit damage is worth exactly twice as much as crit chance in terms of power budget, meaning that crit chance is about twice as valuable for your damage because it's about twice as hard to get. Knowing that the game is going to treat crit damage as like easier to acquire than crit chance is important to know, because then when you see 5% crit damage, you think, oh, that's like 2.5% crit chance, and that could be helpful. Warframe does this too. A big example in Warframe is that base damage is not worth very much. That means you get a lot of it for a slot. If you get a slot that's all elemental damage, you get less than if that slot is all base damage. Again, to the best of your ability in general. And if you look at base damage mods overall, they broadly give you more base damage than, you know, elemental damage mods or something. Multi-shot is like pretty equal to elemental damage, which has always been a little odd. Status chance is worth relatively little. If you take as an example the dual status mods in Warframe, they give you 60% of an element and 60% status chance, and there are mods that give you 90% of an element with no rider effect for status chance, which means that 30% elemental damage difference is worth 60% status chance. One thing that's really important when you look at a riding effect is how good the deal it is that it's giving you. Is the rider effect giving you two effects on a mod instead of one, but at the cost of how much of the effect? Or do you get two effects and it's a lot of them? You know, there are really good examples of mods that they give you a good deal and it's two effects, which is why they become so widespread, why it's so hard to not use them. Lethal Torrent is a good example in Warframe. EyePatchNotes mentions Chilling Reload a little bit further down. Chilling Reload doesn't give very much cold, but it gives enough to be significant and a lot of reload speed for a mod that already gives you something else, which is good. Chilling Reload has a rider effect, and it's a good deal, if you will. EyePatchNotes concludes a bit by saying riding effects are not a guarantee of Buildcraft, though I feel they are correlated with it. So do I. I think that if a game has riding effects in it, there's probably meaningful build options in that game. It's hard to believe either that or the game is just very, very, very bad. And all of the riding effect things are not worth using, or all the normal things are not worth using. There are a lot of games with like extremely token rider effects. I keep saying rider is what I got used to saying, and riding effects is what you're saying. What are you gonna do? There are some games, I guess kind of a lot of games, that have like an RPG system where the gear you get has a riding effect or a rider effect, but it's like really, really small and doesn't matter. Like a lot of looter shooters, actually. Warframe doesn't have gear like that, but like early weapons in Destiny 2, when I played it, were like this. They would have like some small stat perk, but it was irrelevantly like you would never ever care. And so there were riding effects, but they were very trivial. Something to think about. But I wanted to read EyePatchNotes summary. When specific effect text comes from multiple sources, the main differing factors are the magnitude and the extra effects, if any. So in other words, how much of the primary, I guess, thing you get from that option, and what other riding effects there are, if there are any. Thus, EyePatchNotes perceives riding effects as the developer's chance to demonstrate understanding of their own systems. Player options always invite comparisons, and a little obfuscation from the developer goes a long way. Closer to an apples and oranges or incomparables approach, arguably healthier than chasing the biggest numbers. I agree. For the rest of this parlay, I'd like to talk about what makes for good writing effects, because kind of the elephant in the room here is that thing I said before about stat value and multitasking being inherently valuable. It depends on the game. It does. But there's a question about, I almost feel like you can say heavy caliber in Warframe. So Serration and heavy caliber give the same amount of base damage, and heavy caliber gives you negative accuracy. So if I tell you you're the game designer, we're making two mods. One of them is just base damage. The other one is base damage and it reduces your accuracy. In this game, usually accuracy reduction is bad. So Serration, our theoretical Serration, gives 150% base damage. I know it doesn't. This is a simplified example. Should our theoretical mod with the riding effect give more or less base damage? I don't think almost anybody would say it should give the same amount of base damage. You see what I'm trying to say? And maybe you would. Maybe that's interesting because it says being inaccurate is as often good as bad in Warframe, and this is just a choice. But in my mind, if it's literally just allowing you to choose whether the weapon is accurate or not, like the Warframe has the weapon excellence slot for that, and I would often feel like that was a messy design choice. Should that really be in base damage where we give the player that option? Should we make a weapon excellence slot? And then they did. So let's agree that it probably doesn't make sense for it to give the same amount of base damage in both places. It should probably be less or more, right? And what's natural is to think that if the mod gives you a negative effect as a rider, it should give you more of the positive thing, the sort of core thing. If Serration gives you 150 and heavy caliber reduces your accuracy, heavy caliber should give you more base damage. In Warframe, it gives the same amount or less. Magnum Force is like this with Hornet Strike, but it gives you less base damage and reduced accuracy. Why? Why is that? I'm pretty sure I know why. I think it's because Digital Extremes thinks of it as, well, but if the player is just going to think about piling on base damage, we want that to intuitively feel like it gets worse and worse. It does get worse and worse because that's how math works. If you already have 150% damage and you add 150% more, it's worth less than it was previously. You get the same amount of damage, I guess, but it isn't as powerful as it was before because you already have 150% damage. It's not as dramatic an increase in your power, and there is an opportunity cost there. If you could have added something else that would multiply the damage you have, you didn't by adding more base damage, so there is a sort of a loss. But in Warframe, usually the game punishes you for that. You get diminishing returns, as I usually call them. There's marginal benefit loss, which I would explain as when a game, obeys normal math, and you benefit less from getting the same benefit over and over. The game gives you the same benefit, but it's less good once you already have some, because that's how math works. You're only adding to something you already have a lot of. The percentage difference is not as large. But then there are diminishing returns, which is when a game gives you less every time. It's kind of like automatic marginal benefit. The game actually shows you, like, look, you are getting less benefit because you already added some, which is unnecessary. There's that weirdness, right? Like, it's already always automatically bad to just stack more on top of what you have if there are other options. So if there are other options, which there are in Warframe, you could add different multipliers instead of stacking base damage. Why make there be diminishing returns? Like, why isn't Magnum Force automatically just as good as Hornet Strike or better? Really, it should just be better. And here's what I think happened. I think for Warframe, for Digital Extremes' part, they're worried about the community's attitude where they want like the big bongo damage numbers. So in Warframe, when developing Warframe, the people at Digital Extremes are not stupid and don't understand math. They do. They understand everything I just said. But they thought, oh, we should probably do something that kind of inherently discourages the player from stacking a bunch of damage to sort of implicitly help them understand that that is not mathematically effective. Or maybe they don't care about this at all. but that's a potential narrative. And I think that's really interesting. I really like what you're saying, EyePatchNotes, about how rider effects and their relationship to the other parts of the game can be a really interesting barometer for the game's how much the developers understand the game. But I think it can also be motivated by really complicated things, like the multitasking stat thing, or in Hades as a good example. I think Hades is broadly balanced really well, and there are some duo boons that seem really overpowered, but when you think about how you get them, they actually have made some complicated design considerations, most of the time anyway, for why, this can be this powerful, because you have to do this to get it, something like that. And I do think that in Warframe, how like a mod might be more rare, so it's more powerful, that's not effective, because you don't know what access to the mods the player has. In Warframe, you can buy the mods from other players, you might just get lucky and get the mod, and then relatively frequently the whole balance of like, oh, this mod is rarer so it's better, falls apart, and you have tons of mods that, to you, the layperson player, it feels pointless that these mods are weaker, So I agree. I feel like looking at those systems, with a magnifying lens and thinking about why is this way, is that a good reason for it to be that way, is a very good way to evaluate a game's build options. It can be really interesting. I feel like looking at a lot of games that way is fun, is fulfilling. There's stuff there. I could see a series perhaps on the subject. Maybe, I don't know. But it's a really useful idea. To summarize myself, I feel like the main point here is that writing effects can be balanced a lot of ways, and they are balanced a lot of ways, and a lot of those ways are probably bad. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like in a vacuum, if something is going to have an extra effect on it, that's inherently usually powerful. And so maybe the overall power budget for that mod should be the same or lower rather than, higher, unless the rider is negative, in which case maybe the power budget can go up. But I don't think that a mod or a game piece, it doesn't have to be a mod in Warframe, it doesn't seem like nearly ever should a mechanic with a riding effect be the same as the non-riding effect one, but just with the riding effect. That just doesn't seem... it'd have to be a very clever rider effect for it to be, I'm literally just mixing riding and rider like there's no tomorrow. It's a free range, organic, farm to table parlay where we just say whatever version of the word we want. Sure. Anyway, it's really interesting. I think I said what I had to say. I really like riding effects. They're fun. I like to ride them. They're exciting. I really like this point, and I think we'll be coming back to it, about how usually, your game gives limited spaces to add mechanics in. You only have 8 mod slots. You only have your 5 artifacts and your weapon and the character's ascension stat. You only have 5 core boons in Warframe, Genshin Impact, and Hades, respectively. And riding effects are inherently powerful in that they increase the number of slots there. If the game doesn't have a limited number of modifiers, that may begin to matter less. But I do think it's interesting to note examples like Slay the Spire, where the number of slots are variable, meaning that the value of multitasking is variable rather than it being inherently that it's, you have 8 cards, so you better fit a lot of effects on those 8, or everything you need on those 8 cards, or your deck has like 40 cards. Slay the Spire is a deck building roguelike, and you have plenty of room for everything. You don't need to multitasking your cards, but you have a lot of cards. It's a really interesting aspect of the game. A big breakthrough in Slay the Spire for newer players is that you want your deck to be small most of the time, and selling cards is good. Taking cards is kind of inherently bad unless the card is really good, or builds up to something, or you really need it right now or whatever. And so that's a really good takeaway if you have nothing else about riding effects in your brain, is that it should inherently be considered powerful. When you see a lot of text on something, and the text is multiple effects rather than some cockamamie description of an effect, that usually means this thing is probably pretty good from a build crafting perspective. The developer will usually understand that players might be intimidated or not as quick to commit, but if you can get that thing to work with the writing effect, it's probably powerful. They're not often bad. A lot of the time, the vanilla version is kind of just waiting to be usurped by something else, and should be seen more as a baseline rather than the bar to clear. It's very easy to defeat something that only gives one effect in one slot. That's not hard. So I'd rather consider Pressure Point, Serration, Hornet Strike in Warframe more like the baseline rather than the default. They're kind of the worst option rather than like the default good one that you try to beat. It's easy to beat them. Anything beats them. But they, especially in Warframe where you just don't need damage that much, Buildcraft just busts.